I have a great future behind me, and but this party has a great future ahead of it. We're going to go into the general election campaign in 2015 pledged to increase the number of people on job seekers allowance. All those MPs and MEPs who have betrayed our country, let down our people, wasted our money, poured billions down the drain, all those bureaucrats, eurocrats and crangocrats, parasites on the back of the hard-working, overtaxed and over-regulated wealth creators who are the lifeblood of this nation. But we want to see them all on the go. But we want to get the rest of our country back to work and off welfare. Of course, the background to all this is that our public finances are in a complete mess, thanks to the man whom Douglas Carswell notoriously calls Mr. Osborne, because he can see no discernible difference between the economic policy followed by Mr. Osborne and his predecessor, Mr. Gordon Brown. As we know, the public sector deficit this year is going to be £100 billion, £8 billion more than last year. The Treasury forecasts there will be a deficit of £120 billion next year and £120 billion the year after that. In fact, it will almost certainly be higher because we're in a triple-dip recession now and we'll be in a quadruple-dip recession very shortly. Although Mr. Osborne has the reputation of being a Mr. Scrooge, in fact he's a Mr. Micawber, because he's constantly in debt and just hopes that something is going to turn up. And there is no way in which he's going to make any serious inroads onto that deficit without having some significant forms of welfare, which now consumes over £200 billion a year, about a third of the entire sum that a government spends during the course of 12 months. And it is preposterous, isn't it, that welfare subsidies are going to the likes of Mr. Frank Dodson, an ex-Labour cabinet minister, still a member of Parliament, very well paid, who lives in a council house, with subsidised rents paid for by you and me as taxpayers. Mr. Bob Crow, who's very sound on Europe, but not much else, earning £133,000 a year as the General Secretary of his trade union. He also lives in a subsidised council house. Labour government, of course, was not terribly good for people's health in this country, because over the 13 years of the Blair and Brown governments, the number of people on disability living allowance went up by 1 million, from 2.4 million to 3.3 million. And as we've discovered recently, 70% of the people in receipt of disability living allowance are checked to begin with, and then never checked again to see whether they still need it over the whole course of their life. And there is massive waste going on in the bloated welfare state, which has grown up like Topsy over our lifetime, and significant reforms do need to be made. One of the most important features of the modern welfare state is that 53% of the households of this country make no net contribution to the state. They get more in one form of benefit or subvention than they contribute in the form of taxation. And that's up from 44% in 2001. In Scotland, a staggering figure, 88% of households receive more in benefits from the state than they contribute to it. Now, this was a deliberate act of policy, of course, on the part of the Labour government. Their policies on immigration and welfare has been to increase the client state, which they thought would keep them in office forever, because if people are dependent upon you for their benefits, then you calculate that they're going to give you their votes in order to keep them. Well, we have to dismantle that form of political corruption. There are other features as well that we've got to deal with. There was an interview in Closer magazine, which I don't read very often, I have to admit, very recently, of a couple who had 10 children and are getting £50,000 a year in state benefits. The woman concerned said she felt guilty about this, but it wasn't her fault, it was the government's fault, because the minimum wage isn't big enough, and horror of horrors, if you work, then your benefit is reduced. It never occurred to her, of course, that she could have restricted the size of her family according to her means and cut her coat according to her cloth. Those attitudes of fecklessness and irresponsibility have to be changed. It is easy, of course, to sound hard-faced, ungenerous and cruel in seeking to reform the welfare state, whereas it isn't, and changes introduced have to be done with humanity and indeed sensitivity. And the present government is not always able to do that. The so-called bedroom tax, for example, which is a blunt instrument if ever I saw one, reminds me of the do-it-yourself. I don't do much of this myself, that's one of the reasons I got married. But the do-it-yourselfer knocking a nail in the wall unerringly hits his thumb rather than the nail. And I think we'll find that bedroom tax, so-called, will become a bit of a poll tax, which will be good in theory, but actually disastrous in the way it is implemented and turns out in practice. It will end up as not freeing up a great deal of social housing, but will actually make the poor already poorer. Now, there are many other important elements in welfare which my colleagues will speak about following me this afternoon. But of course, the big elephant in the room on welfare is the impact which immigration has had upon it. Such things as the absurdity of people coming here from Eastern Europe, because they can, to work, nothing wrong with that, but you can then claim child benefit for children who have never even been to this country at all and send the money back home. And so what Nigel was saying this morning about nobody being able to claim for benefits in this country unless they've been here with a 5-year contribution record is an absolute prerequisite of sorting out the welfare morass that we've been. So we're doing some serious thinking and serious work about welfare reform, some practical, nuts and bolts proposals. We're not going to redesign the entire welfare state. That will improve the lives of ordinary people and wean people who are able-bodied off the benefit system to which too many people are addicted